everyone, how's it going? Juan Dhas here, and here's another lesson video for you all. Today we're going to be talking about modal voicings, and this is just a quick housekeeping intro. I've got a gig coming up next week. It's the album release show here in Bogota, so if you happen to be in town, come on through. All the details are on my website, and I've been announcing it through Instagram and Facebook and wherever, so even here on YouTube. So if you're in town, come on through, please. It would be wonderful to see you there. So this week's, it's been a while since I've done a video, but this week's topic comes off the back of a Reddit comment, actually, where someone was asking, we were talking about modes and just chord scale theory and just kind of how chord scale theory can be used, or at least how it's just one facet of improvising. I don't really believe one sole theory is the be-all, end-all. It's really just a multitude of perspectives. But we were talking about how to build modal voicings briefly. So to the commenter on Reddit, thank you so much for the topic, and that's why I'm doing this video for you and for everyone, really. And thank you to everyone, by the way, who's been supporting the videos, the new music, and so on. It genuinely means the world. But let's talk about modal voicings. And I think to really talk about modal voicings, we've got to go back and do some housekeeping with just modes and things to understand about modes that will probably help when it actually comes time to talk about the voicings. So let's get this out of the way real quick. So let's say we have a context of G major 7, right? G major 7, and the general chord scale theory. By the way, I have a video talking about this. It's, I think, something to do with harmonic awareness, and I might have a few other videos here and there. Go check that out. Although, heads up, it was the first lesson video I think I ever did on the channel, so my camera personality is probably much closer to cardboard than anything else. But anyway, let's get into it. So the general chord scale theory is that you have a chord that goes with a scale, and unfortunately a lot of people stop there. There are actually other things that have to be taken into account when you really understand how a chord or a mode, or a chord scale or a mode works. So let's say we have that G major 7 sound. Now let's just keep it simple and say that Ionian is the chord scale that goes with this particular chord. Great. So we have a G Ionian scale, otherwise known as G major. Now, people are probably more familiar with how to build the scale or the mode and the characteristic notes, but there are other things to take into account. So the first thing we think of is, what are the chord tones? So when we have a G major 7 chord, of the scale, what are our chord tones? Well, it's 1, the root, the major 3rd, the 5, and the major 7. Pretty self-explanatory. And this, you change accordingly for dominant chords, minor chords, and so on and so forth. Then we have our tensions, right? Now, the general working rule for tensions is that they have to be a major 9 above a chord tone. The exception usually is for dominant chords where we have flat 9, sharp 9, and so on. But the tension will usually always be a major 9 above a chord tone. So if we have our root, is there a note within the scale that is diatonic to the mode, right, that is a major 9 above this chord tone? Yes, there is. It would be A. Just as a general shortcut, this usually translates to just look for what note is a whole step above your chord tone, right? But it's good to discuss the theory so you know where things come from, right? So what about the 3rd? Well, we don't really have one that's a major 9 above that respects the Ionian mode. We'll get into that in a little bit. What about the 5th? Right, so we have D, yep, E, and sure enough, it respects that rule. So for a G major 7 chord, where Ionian is the chord scale, our available tensions for this chord are 9 and 13. So we can actually use them both on this existing chord. Great, now we get into avoid notes. Avoid notes, now it's kind of a bit of a nomenclature thing, but avoid notes doesn't mean avoid this note at all costs and never use it. It just means handle this note with care. If you hang on it for too long, it can be a little tense, for lack of a better word, and not in the good kind, like a tension where it's like a pleasing kind of tension. It can sound a little sour, for lack of a better word. So be careful with it, but you, on occasion, do have to use this note to reflect the sound of the scale, and we'll discuss why shortly. But let's say we have G major, right? Okay, so for instance, the avoid note simply means handle this C with care. The avoid note is usually a flat 9 above a chord tone. Again, this simplifies to look what is a half step above a chord tone, with certain exceptions in mind, such as a flat 9 on a dominant chord, right? So that'll usually create this weird harmonic rub. However, we'll discuss where the rules can be broken shortly, and that factors into modal voicings. And then this is probably the concept where people are most familiar, or the concept people are most familiar with when it comes to modes, and that is, what is the characteristic note? Because a lot of, especially guitar players, we kind of obsess over this. You know, like Lydian has a sharp 4, Dorian has a natural 6, Phrygian has a flat 2. This is just one piece of the puzzle of understanding modes in general and how they relate to not just chords, but greater progressions. So, it just so happens, the way I like to explain it is, it's not just a note that's important, it's just what is the characteristic note is the note that differentiates this scale from other scales. So if we take, just for instance, for the sake of comparison, 2 modes, right? Ionian and Lydian. So Ionian, if we take the 4th out of both, right, and we just have the other 6 notes remaining, right, then there's really no difference between the 2 scales, but let's say I just introduce this 4, this natural 4, right? Ah, okay, that's the characteristic note. That gives you the sound of Ionian or G major. And vice versa, if I had the sharp 4 in there, right, this would give me the sound of Lydian and the expression of that sound or color. And we're going to hang on to that little phrase, the expression of a sound or a color, right? So this is just a quick crash course on just chord scale theory, important things to think about. There are other things to cover, but we may save that for another video, just to kind of, you know, reinforce that in its own time. We're talking about modal voicings today. So what is a modal voicing, or how do we use them, or how do we create them? Well, a modal voicing, the way I like to explain it is, it's a voicing, or just a singular chord, that expresses the sound of that particular mode. So I'm just going to rephrase that. It's a singular chord, just one chord, that expresses within the chord itself, it expresses the sound of that mode and gives you the color of that without having to jump through too many chords. Now, you can expand this definition when we talk about modal progressions, right? Where it's a series of chords that expresses the sound of a mode. But at the end of the day, it boils down to the same definition of, and the same question we can ask ourselves, does this express the sound I'm looking for? So let's dive into an example. And this is where the rules start being bent a little bit. Now, do bear in mind, and I think this bears adding a disclaimer or a caveat, right? You have to, when we think about a mode, or when we think about modal voicings, rather, they're usually tied to a very particular context, as in the musical context they are played in, right? I wouldn't necessarily use a voicing like this, right? Or like this on most standard repertoire, right? On most, Great American Songbook repertoire, it just doesn't fit the sound of the music. But if we're talking about just composition, or we're talking about modal tunes like shorter tunes, or just general modal tunes, right? Then we can start bending the rules a little bit, because after all, that is the crux of that music, of modal music, right? We want to hear the sound and the color of the mode. So let's talk about this voicing, because I use this as an example, where we have a D major triad, right? So A, D, F sharp, right? 5, 1, and 3. But then I have this 4 on top of it. And by logic of the chord scale system as we know it, that would dictate, oh, the 4 is an avoid note, therefore we must avoid this note at all costs. Remember, these notes have to be handled with care. And I don't know about you guys, but I like that voicing a lot. You'll hear not just musicians like Alan Holdsworth, obviously, but you'll hear musicians like Russell Ferrante from the Yellow Jackets, Chick, many modern pianists, kind of use these crunchy voicings. And the idea is to express the sound of that mode, right? So what's the general theory if we were to break this apart? Well, we have our major triad, and we have the characteristic note of the mode added into the chord. Now, I will say if you were to treat this like a major 7 voicing and had... can I play this? I'm gonna just do a different version of the voicing, right? So, like, we've got D, a shell version, if you would. That sounds a little clunky, and that's because we've got that tritone in there, right? But if I were to just have a major triad on the 4, it's a pleasing sound. So, at the end of the day, this is why you have to handle the avoid note with care. Now, here's a question. What if the avoid note and the characteristic note are the same note? Then you have to handle it with even more care just to make sure that you're not creating any unwanted dissonances. So, basically, we can determine if I take a major triad and I put a 4 on it, then we get this add 11 sound or something that is very Ionian in nature. So, for example, one of my favorite Ionian voicings is this chord, which is actually the opening chord for Air and Water on my new album, which I've got... I don't play it with the 7 because I didn't have the 7th string at the time of recording it, but I've got A, D, F sharp. I've got the open G string, D, and the E sitting on top, which is actually the 9. So something else you can do for modal voicings to add a little bit more color is to add available tensions to this existing chord, right? And that'll give you the expression of that particular sound or color or mode. So now that we understand the theory, I'm going to take you through the 7 modes. So we've already covered Ionian, so I don't have to discuss that too much, but I'm going to take you through a couple of the other modes and show you the thought process so that you can see how I'm building this, or how I'm thinking of this, or how I'm creating these chords and voicings, so that you can hopefully try it on your own using my process as a blueprint. So let's take Dorian, right? So Dorian, let's just do a quick analysis. So we've got... Dorian works with minor 7 chords, right? So I've got 9 is a tension, the 11 is a tension, and the 13, natural 13 is a tension. So in and of itself, this, just a minor 7 with a 13 on it, will be a modal voicing. But how else can I, let's say, more fully express the sound of this chord? Well, I've got this E as an open string. So what if I took a G minor 11 and added that? Pretty cool sound. What if I did this, or I took an A minor triad and put it over a G bass? That leads us more into sus territory, but I can actually move this C down a whole step to B flat, so I still get the minor 3rd, and that gives me a different sound altogether. Maybe if I have the open E, this is a bit of a left-hand cramp. Yeah, I don't know if I can reach that. There it is. So, I'm starting to think of possibilities, or what if I take a chordal voicing? So I've got G, C, and F, and then I still have that open E on top. Or if I did, that actually takes us into Lydian territory. But you see, I'm trying to respect, okay, keep the original sound of the chord, it's a minor triad, and then add in sounds or the tensions necessary to change this into the sound I'm looking for. Oop, what if I did? That's redundant, but... Oop. There's a cool one, right? So the idea is you can build these chords on their own and then, you know, start using them wherever you feel like. So what if I did Phrygian? One of the really common ones for Phrygian is sus flat 9. So this, for instance, is actually the first chord for Wayne Shorter's Anna Maria, right? So we're avoiding the minor third, although you can add the minor third and it'll give you that more direct Phrygian quality. But it tends to almost obfuscate or hide the sound in some ways just by having that interval so close together. So another voicing I like to use for Phrygian is F minor over G, for G Phrygian, right? So I've got flat 9, flat 7, sus 4, and the root on top. So sometimes we may not have to use the third, especially if it gets a little too crunchy, but therefore, that would also technically fall under Phrygian. Or let's see, ooh, I wonder how this is going to sound. I don't hate the voicing. You see what I mean? So sometimes you'll find these colors where they might not be immediately useful, but you might be able to find a use for them. Okay, so what about Lydian? And by the way, something I forgot to mention, when we come into finding modal voicings, this is where we'll usually find, you know, like triad over bass note voicings. Does that make sense? So for example, a very common one for Lydian would be an A triad over a G bass. And that really expresses that Lydian quality. Sometimes what I like to do is add the fifth in there in the bottom. So it kind of thickens up the chord a little bit and just makes it sound a little fuller. But that's a very immediate quality. And what I'll do is I'll take these voicings and I'll play around with how the chord is actually voiced. So what if I did an open A triad, but with a G bass? This is going to have a tritone in the bottom, but okay, I don't hate it. Or what if I did, G bass. That's another color that we can use. What about Mixolydian? So Mixolydian, the characteristic note is B flat, right? So that's why you'll see a lot of sus chords, right? Or F triad over G bass, because that really plays into the sus sound. But here's a voicing that's become very common as of late, where you actually stick the third in there, and you have the flat 7 right here in the middle of the chord. It's a very common Mixolydian chord. Play around with that. As you know, I could move my, I could use the, actually that's a really good one for Dorian, but I could have the bass player play the G bass, and I could play this. Sometimes you'll find chords that are kind of really tough to play on the guitar, but don't think of it, if you're a composer, you know, think of how you can orchestrate the voicing, if you would. Have the bass player play this, you play this, or if you have bass, piano, and guitar, you know, divide the voicing in between the three. Much like if you were to voice a chord for a string section, if you would. So what about Aeolian? Okay, this is a really common one. Many people might mislabel this as a minor 7 sharp 5 chord. Not quite. Let's dive in and see why. So we've got C, A flat, B flat, E flat, and we've got G on top. So if we actually take out the A flat for a moment and we just play these, you've actually got a minor 7 chord already baked into this. If you were to follow that theory of minor 7 sharp 5, then you wouldn't have a natural 5 on top of the chord. So this would probably be more accurately described as minor 7 flat 6, which is closer to an Aeolian voicing. So, and then for Locrian, you know, we've got our minor 7 flat 5 chord. Let's do it from G, right? just so we hear the comparison across all the modes. So we have it from G. And what else can we do? We can add, so let's dive into the chord scale. So as far as tensions are concerned, on a Locrian scale, you have an 11. So I could actually have a C somewhere in here. Let's see, what if I did this? Right, so that'd be a cool little voicing to try. And then maybe we can, to make this a more modal progression, then we can resolve it to B flat, right? What if I also added flat 13? Because that's actually a whole step above your flat 5, right? So I could actually do, in theory, right? Okay. And here you see we're starting to get into the territory of modal progressions. But you can start experimenting. You see the thought process of how I'm putting this together, right? There are some voicings that are maybe a little more obvious, right? Like this D major with the 4 in it. But when we start getting into Locrian or Phrygian, then we start actually kind of having to tweak, and I only have 4 fingers. We have to make do with what we have. It's much easier on a piano. But I would actually recommend guitar players, play a little bit of piano and just experiment with how the voicing or how the voices sit, so that you get the best expression of the chord that you're looking for. Now, we only have done this for the major scale modes, but this would apply to melodic minor modes and harmonic minor modes, and that's when we start really getting into modal territory, right? As opposed to, playing this in a functional context. So here's where we start to see the two schools of thought deviating. There's modal playing and modal composition, and then there is diatonic functional harmony and composition that really goes, I really have to make that point very clear. So I hope this lesson was great for you all and, gave you some ideas as to what you can try. So have fun with it, and I'll see you in another video. Take care, guys.